All right, so this is a close-up of the center of a daisy, or at least an artist's rendition of a microscopic view. That ball there is known as a meristem, and what it does is it sort of coughs out these clusters of smaller cells, and those sort of push out and take their place wherever there's the most room for them. And you might imagine that this leads to some kind of disorganized congestion, but actually, as these little clusters of cells grow and expand outward, a certain orderliness starts to appear. And these are clusters of cells that are going to grow and differentiate and mature into the florets in the center of a daisy. And as we zoom out, you can see that the pattern that was established at a microscopic scale actually persists to the macroscopic scale. This is a common sort of motif in nature called a phylotactic spiral. And you can see it's kind of flat here. You also often see it draped around bulbs and artichokes and flowers and things. And it's easy to spot because it seems to consist of two sets of spirals going in opposite directions. So for example, there's that set. And if you actually counted it up, you'd see that there's 13 spirals going that way. And then there's this other set, and if you counted these up, interestingly, there's more of them. There's actually 21. So although it looks very symmetrical, it's actually extremely lopsided. And these numbers, 13 and 21, have a special significance. They are neighboring numbers in something known as the Fibonacci series. So this is a fairly famous series of numbers. It starts 1 and 1, and the rule is you get each next number in the Fibonacci series by adding the previous two. So 1 plus 1 equals 2, 1 plus 2 equals 3, 2 plus 3 equals 5, 3 plus 5 equals 8, and so on. And plants are really into these numbers when they're dressing themselves in countervailing spirals. They always pick two neighboring Fibonacci numbers. And they produce some really interesting patterns. So like an artichoke has 5 spirals going in one direction and 8 going in the other, up through 13 and 21. I think the most number of spirals seen in nature there are some big sunflowers that have 144 spirals going in one direction and 233 going in the other. And what I'd like to do in this talk is actually present about half a dozen artworks by our friend John Edmark. John Edmark has done a lot of different kinds of artworks, and he works in several different media. But what I want to focus on today is his fascination with this particular pattern that's been offered to us by nature. So the first piece I want to talk about is called Chromataxis. And to begin, here's a kind of cleaned up presentation of some of the spirals that we're going to be considering. The numbers, again, refer to the number of spirals going in opposite directions. And I want to kind of zero in on the smallest one here, just because it actually gets pretty hard to see the spirals when you're dealing with small numbers like this. So here's a spiral going counterclockwise around the center, and you can see that there's 3 of those in total. Going the other way, you have a clockwise spinning spiral, which is one of 5. And of course, there are some smaller ones that hardly look like spirals at all, and mathematically this pattern goes up indefinitely. So what are some things we can notice about these spirals? One thing we can see is that there aren't any triangles or pentagons. They all consist of areas that have 4 sides. And those 4-sided areas are actually very well lined up. There's 4 of them clustered around each point. So locally, these things look just kind of like distorted square grids. And one thing we can do with a square grid is we can color it in with a checkerboard pattern. So a question we might ask is, what happens if we try and checkerboard one of these phylotactic spirals? So the rule for checkerboarding something is to first randomly choose one of the squares to be black. The adjacent squares should be colored white, and any diagonal squares should be colored black. And if we just repeatedly apply this rule over and over again, we can get a very nice checkerboard pattern on our 13 by 21 spiral. Now, we can checkerboard this one, but a follow-up question would be, can we checkerboard all of them? And the answer to this is actually no. If we try and checkerboard the 813 spiral, something goes wrong. So if, say, we choose that square to be black and the neighboring one to be white, this diagonal one should be black, and actually the chain of diagonals should all be black. But as we get back here, we can see there's a problem now. We have a white square that's diagonal to a black square. So the pattern is placing conflicting constraints on what color that square should be. It's like the checkerboard fails to sync up with itself properly as you go around the center. So that's a legitimate difference between the 813 spiral and the 1321 spiral. 1321 can be checkered, but 813 is actually uncheckerable. So what about 5-8? This one is also uncheckerable for similar reasons. What about 3, 5? This one actually can be checkered. It looks a little distorted, but it technically qualifies. And the bigger ones are also uncheckerable. So the rule here, it turns out, is that a phylotactic spiral can only be checkered if its two sets of spirals are both odd numbers. And the pattern of Fibonacci numbers is odd, odd, even, odd, odd, even, odd, odd, even. So basically every third phylotactic spiral is going to be checkerable. But John took a closer look at this supposedly uncheckerable pattern. What really goes wrong here? Well, if you start with that one being black, and then you follow a chain of diagonals, you end up with an adjacent one needing to be black. And this breaks the rules of the checkerboard. So John came up with a kind of colorful way of resolving this conflict. Colors come in distinct steps, and as you go around the color wheel, they're cyclic. So instead of coloring these checkers black, why don't we start with sort of a red color, and then the diagonal one will change the hue just slightly. So these are slightly different colors, but they still read as sort of belonging together. And if we continue to step around the color wheel as we step around the phylotactic spiral, taking just the right size steps, when we get back to the conflict square, we can see that they're now approximately opposite colors. So the rules of the checkerboard have been satisfied, kind of. Now there's still some more blank spaces to fill in, so if we keep going around the color wheel, by the time we get back to where we started, we now have two diagonals that also seem to have synced up quite nicely. So by using this sort of chromatic stepping procedure, we can overcome the uncheckerability of this phylotactic spiral. And this is an art piece called Chromataxis, which sort of completes this idea. And for good measure, John used 89 different hues, which is also a Fibonacci number. But I think this is a great example of how John has kind of found aesthetic ways of playing with the mathematical properties of these patterns. So the next one I want to show you is called Fibonacci tiling. So here's a question we could ask. As this spiral grows out from the meristem, we can see that the outer areas are much bigger than the ones in the interior. But are they the same shape? You can imagine that maybe the ones in the interior are kind of squat, and the ones as they get further out are more oblong or something. So to settle this, let's color in that small one there, and it's going to leave behind a little orange outline. And we're going to sample it at several times as it grows. And this will get easier to see as it gets bigger. But basically, it's just leaving these orange footprints behind so we can compare its shape at different stages of growth. And if we line these all up, we can see, indeed, they are all the same shape. So this weird quadrilateral is sort of the basic building block of these phylotactic spirals. So John imagined this as being a little bit like a piece of a jigsaw puzzle. And he even made these correctly sized little tabs. And this is Fibonacci tiling. It's a design for a jigsaw puzzle, and this puzzle has some really weird properties. Every piece is the same shape, but as it turns out, no two pieces are the same size. And he actually cut this, he laser cut this out of wood, and a lot of his artifacts are actually these stop motion animations he made, which depict that if you pull out the pieces from biggest to smallest, you can kind of make this tower. And because they're getting exponentially smaller, you can see the tower starts getting very tall very quickly. And actually another property of this puzzle is that you would actually need an infinite number of pieces to fill in that finite area at the center. The next one I want to talk about is called Helicone. So the Fibonacci tiling actually gives us a fun new way to think about this pattern. Instead of as a pattern that grows out from a center, it can be a pattern that sort of grows in stages by the addition of pieces around the perimeter. And if you keep adding pieces around the perimeter, you may get the feeling you're doing something a little bit repetitive. If that's the most recent piece, and this is the next piece, we can measure the angular offset between them, and we find that it's about 137.5 degrees. And this is consistent from one piece to the next. So the next piece is 137.5 degrees further around, as is the next one. So this angle is actually kind of a secret recipe for generating that pattern. And this gave John an idea, I guess. If you cut out a little barbell-shaped thing, and it has maybe a hole in the center that you can stick an axle through so it can spin around, and it has a little pin sticking out of it, then you can bring in a second piece with a specially curved slot in it that the pin fits into. In one extreme, these two pieces are lined up, but if you rotate it out to the other extreme, then it'll be fanned out by 37.5 degrees. Now, that second piece also has a pin sticking out of it, which will shift the orange over there. And a third piece can be brought in, which basically does the same thing. So you just keep repeating this angular offset, and it should eventually generate a kind of phylotactic spiral. And by elaborating on this idea, John came up with this device called the Helicone. basically this is one orientation, and then with a flick of the wrist, you can get it to form a kind of double pine cone. Of course, the beauty of making the physical thing is that you can find out what happens if you just let it spin freely. So if you just give it a quick twist, the pattern actually kind of builds up from the bottom. So the next one I want to talk about is called Transtower, and this is a really fun one for me to get to talk about because I actually got to help John with part of this one. So if we think about the Fibonacci pattern as sort of growing by the addition of pieces, then we can actually think of it as growing in steps. So here are two copies, but the one on the right, we're going to add another piece. So in some sense, the one on the right is the next step after the one on the left. And we can shift our attention from these particular pieces to the overall outline. Now, what is the outline of one generation compared to the outline of the next generation? If we lay them on top of each other, we can see that they completely sync up except where that one piece has been added. But keep in mind that the one on the right has a piece that's been added there, and the one on the left was created by a piece that was added 137.5 degrees off. So if we rotate the right one so that those two newest pieces are aligned, and we lay them on top of each other again, we find that they're actually the same shape. The addition of pieces is not changing the overall shape, it's just changing its apparent orientation. So if we have two generations of outline, there are two distinct ways we can lay them on top of each other. So John began cutting out not the puzzle pieces themselves, but the overall shape. And So by sort of stacking these up, you can create a sculpture that by rotating each piece 137.5 degrees from the one below it takes on a series of stair steps. And these are the two orientations that were planned for when John made Transtower. But actually, there are a lot of other patterns it can make. So if you turn it another 137.5 degrees, you actually get twice as many stair steps, and they kind of fan out. So what we were discovering, or what John was discovering, was that there are all these patterns in here that he hadn't planned for. And I first met John when he was an artist in residence at the Exploratorium in about 2009, and we were playing with this and discussing other kinds of patterns you might create. So if each piece was, say, 180 degrees off of the one below it, then it would sort of alternate and you'd get this sort of striped configuration. If you rotated it negative 137.5 degrees, instead of stair steps, you got these sort of overhangs, and it had this sort of Christmas tree configuration. And the big insight was just that these were just the ones we could think of. There were probably all kinds of patterns in here, but you never really got to see them because, for instance, this one has a sort of pin and slot mechanism, and when you try and twist it up, it doesn't really uniformly twist up. It's sort of a mess between the starting point and the ending point. What we really needed was some kind of mechanism that kind of uniformly twisted up like this. And in order to make that, we needed some sort of gearing or clockwork that could be spun continuously, but which somehow forced each layer to be a constant angular offset from the one below it. And when trying to think about what this might look like, we found this was kind of a discouragingly difficult seeming problem. But anyway, I had this idea in my mind, and back then I used to survive off of these cups of instant ramen noodles I could get out of the vending machines at the Exploratorium. So I was microwaving some soup, and I was watching it spin around, and I noticed that something kind of extraordinary was happening. So in order to show it to you, let's review what you can see on the inside of a microwave. There's the floor of the microwave, and then there's the glass dish, and then there's actually a couple of pieces of hardware that support the glass dish. First of all, there's a little rotor in the center that's driven by a motor, and that slots into the bottom of the dish and makes it turn. And then there's also this thing called a Lazy Susan, which is just a plastic ring with little wheels on it. And this is there just to give the glass dish sort of frictionless support. So it just sort of rolls along between the floor and the dish as it rotates. And the thing I noticed was that there was this little crack in the glass dish, and it was exactly lined up with one of the wheels right in front of me. So I was just watching it sort of spin around in the microwave, and I noticed that on the second time around, it perfectly lined up with a wheel again. And I kept watching, and this kept happening every second rotation. So then I started paying attention to which wheel it was. So we'll use an orange circle to track the crack and a blue circle to track the wheel. And what you'll see is after 2 rotations, the crack perfectly laps that wheel, and it's just the same wheel over and over again that it keeps lining up with. And this seemed really weird to me, because it seemed like it would depend critically on the radius and the diameter of that wheel, and it just seemed odd to imagine that somebody at GE would go to all the trouble of like designing this to be perfect, given that it didn't matter. And then I had a series of realizations. So the first thing I realized was that actually these distances don't matter. In a sense, the Lazy Susan has no choice but to go exactly half as fast as the thing it's supporting. And to understand why, look at things from the perspective of the wheel on the Lazy Susan. We'll cover it with checkerboard so you can see that it's spinning. And at this moment, it's lined up with an orange point on the dish and a blue point on the floor. And what happens is, as that dish moves forward, it rolls the wheel between the floor and the dish. But if we keep up with the wheel, what we can see is actually happening is that, as far as the wheel knows, it's just rotating, and it's pushing equally on the thing above it going forward as it is on the thing below it going backwards. So those 2 distances are necessarily equal. And it has nothing to do with the diameter of the wheel. It's basically just because the wheel is symmetrical. It unspools equally in both dimensions as it turns, and this makes it a natural halving device. So if we rotate the glass dish by, say, 90 degrees, the wheel will move only 45 degrees. It naturally divides that angle into 2 equal parts. A must equal B. And what I realized was that this was actually a 2-story version of the mechanism we were looking for to drive Transtower. And then I realized that you might even be able to stack this up to get a taller version. What you basically needed was a Lazy Susan that could somehow roll on that Lazy Susan. So let's say I bring in a blue Lazy Susan with inward pointing wheels. Here's kind of a cross section of what that looks like. So the blue wheel rolls on the surface of the Lazy Susan, and the yellow wheel is now sandwiched between the blue Lazy Susan and the floor. So it's really in the same position as it was when the glass was resting on it. That is, if we grab that blue Lazy Susan and rotate it 90 degrees, the yellow one will just cut that angular offset in half as usual. But let's think about what happens if we put the glass on top of those blue wheels. Now we have 3 angles we need to think about. There's the angle between the starting position and the yellow wheel, the angle between the yellow wheel and the blue wheel, and the angle between the blue wheel and the crack. So what can we say about these angles? We know, as we said before, that angle A must equal angle B, because that's what Lazy Susans do. What about B and C? Well, actually, B and C must be equal to each other for the same reason. That blue wheel is now rolling between the yellow Lazy Susan and the glass dish, so whatever the offset is between the glass dish and the yellow Lazy Susan, the blue wheel will divide it equally in half. Now, if A equals B and B equals C, then all 3 angles must be equal to each other. As we rotate the glass dish, those 2 Lazy Susans will conspire to divide that angular offset into equal thirds. So this is a 3-story version of the mechanism we were looking for to drive Transtower. We can bring in a 3rd Lazy Susan, and basically you can apply the same logic. You have 4 angles to worry about, but A equals B, B equals C, and C equals D. And this just continues for as many levels as you'd like to add. You can offset the glass dish, and these Lazy Susans will just sort of work it out among themselves to divide that angle up into equal parts. And it makes sense if you think about it, of course, but then if you stop thinking about it, it just seems like magic to me even. But anyway, inspired by the microwave, we made these sort of alternating Lazy Susan-inspired gears. And I really should emphasize that we didn't need to worry about how many teeth were on the gears or what like the pitch diameter was or any of the things that clockmakers typically have to keep track of. We just needed something that would roll smoothly between its upstairs and downstairs neighbors, and the rest should theoretically take care of itself. So we set this up, and we really didn't even know what we were expecting to see, but this is the only existing video of this sculpture we made. And you can see initially it's kind of just looks like a big mess, but then all of a sudden these patterns start to emerge, like one after another after another. And so we have a sort of Christmas tree configuration, and then it's almost like your pattern recognition goes into overdrive, where you almost can't tell where one pattern ends and the next begins. And this goes on for an extremely long time, so I'm going to speed this up just to give you a sense of the profusion of patterns that we saw coming out of this thing. So the idea is that these phylotactic spirals are in some sense like specific instances in a more general catalog of different patterns that are they're also very interesting to explore. So that was Transtower. And this was another version we made that never quite worked perfectly, but it was meant to be twice as tall as this. Anyway, you get the idea. The next one I want to talk about is called Telephone. So this is John telling a secret. Now, if you offset these by half and put them next to each other, that kind of looks like he's telling himself a secret. And the more of these you add, the more you can end up with a kind of secret relay. And so this is an interesting loop. And one way of presenting a looped animation is something called a zoetrope. So this is a kind of simple zoetrope. I've taken 8 frames of this animation and arranged them around a ring. So if we rotate this 45 degrees, each frame advances to the next. So for instance, if we zoom in on the bottom frame there, and let's say we dim the lights, and under cover of darkness, we rotate it 45 degrees, and then set off a flash, we'll see that frame for just a moment. And then if we rotate it 45 degrees and take another flash, we see that frame. And if we start to speed it up so that the wheel is rotating continuously, persistence of vision kicks in, and we start to see a kind of animation. So this is how a thing called a zoetrope works. The problem with this one is that you can see it's pretty choppy. It only consists of 8 frames. We could make it smoother by adding more frames, but then we'd have to make all the frames smaller. So there's this kind of trade-off between size and smoothness we have to deal with. What John realized is that this shape actually recommends itself as a very particular kind of zoetrope. Imagine all of those squares as frames, and if we pick some particular frame, we know that 137.5 degrees back from that is another frame that's about the same size and a little bit further out from the center. So if we rotate it 137 degrees under darkness, when the light comes back on, it'll kind of just look like that square has advanced out and grown a little bit. And that's not true of that particular square only, it's true of all of them. So if we spun this and strobed it every 137.5 degrees, we would have some kind of interesting zoetrope. So this is Telephone. John populated this with frames from his secret telling animation. And it turns out that these phylotactic spirals are extraordinarily efficient zoetropes. And one thing I'd like you to try and do is stare at the center and try and find John when he first appears, and then follow his head as it drifts out to the center. You'll see he actually succeeds in telling this secret 8 times before he disappears. And as you watched that go out, you actually saw every single frame on this surface exactly 1 time. Not 1 frame is wasted. This is very hard to explain. I attempted to show it. If you can see there's that highlighted frame in both of them. As it fans out on the left, you can see the highlight of the frame on the stationary view on the right. So this is how these phylotactic spirals can work as zoetropes. So the last one I want to talk about is blooms, which is really one of my favorite pieces that John has made. And it's just a simple extension of the idea that if a diagrammatic phylotactic spiral works as a zoetrope, then so should an organically 3-dimensional version. So blooms are 3D printed sculptures that are meant to be spun and strobed at a certain rate. So just like before, this is very dark, if we rotate it 137.5 degrees under cover of darkness, when the lights come back on, it should look like each petal has sort of moved out a little bit. This particular bloom is called Flourish, and this is actually what it looks like when it gets animated. But the blooms are not, a specific sculpture. They're almost like a platform for doing 3D animations. So in addition to just petals moving down, John has made a whole variety of other versions of this, which include things like waggling fingers or bubbling spheres or tumbling cubes or even copies of the whole animation itself. And here's a video of some of them. These are really beautiful. Now, if this is true of 3D prints modeled after plants, it actually should also be true of plants themselves. So this is John putting an artichoke in a lathe, and when it's strobed at the right speed, you kind of see this almost like a reproduction of what it should look like when it's growing. And I think this is a very profound insight about the botanical nature of this pattern. To me, it's a little bit like knowing that you can pick up a dandelion and blow the seeds off of it, or knowing you can pull those seeds off those stalks and throw them at your friend's shirt and they all get stuck there. There's all these ways to play with plants if you understand them properly. So this is a very elaborate trick you can do, where if you take this cactus and spin it and then strobe it every 137.5 degrees, you get this kind of creepy, crawly spinning animation on its surface. It's kind of like nature's flip book or something. And so, I'm very fond of John's explorations of this pattern because to me they seem very deeply mathematical. And he doesn't use the sort of abstract symbolic notation that a lot of mathematicians use, but he's doing something that is very mathematical in that he is sort of building on different ideas deductively and coming to a deeper understanding of a pattern from the world. And it sort of reminds me of this quote by the mathematician David Mumford, that mathematics is not alien and remote, but just a very human exploration of the patterns of the world, one which thrives on play and surprise and beauty. Thank you.